Really psyched for today's guest. We have Chris Knobbe, Dr. Chris Knobbe, medical doctor, who we call Obi-Wan Kenobi of inflammatory oils. And a lot of my patients know the Ancestral Diet Revolution. This is an extraordinary book that really goes into why linoleic acid is the devil and how to get inflammatory oils out of your life, anti-inflammatory oils in, and resolve and solve a lot of healthcare issues. And what I love about this book so much is that he gives the data a story while not abandoning the data. There's 1,300 peer-reviewed references. The last quarter of this book is literally just references. And we want to dive into, as a ophthalmologist for many decades, how did you change course and deep dive into diet as a critical part of health and wellness?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me on, Eric. I really appreciate it. And how did I get into this? My own suffering. 30 years ago that I began to develop arthritis, and saw many of my colleague physician friends over the, the next, 17, 20 years. And I eventually took a chance on the paleo diet back in 2011. And some minor changes in my diet, at least for a time. This wasn't permanent, but at least for a time, it radically improved my arthritis. And because of that, I was just so intrigued with what the possibilities of nutrition were. And so I began to investigate nutrition. Then that was 2011. And but honestly, Eric, for 2 years, I felt completely lost. I mean, there were so many things that didn't make sense to me, and without getting into detail, I'll just say that I found differences with Lauren Cordain's work, for example. And it wasn't until I came across Weston A. Price's work in 2013 that I felt that when I learned that processed foods and their nutrient deficiencies. And I didn't understand about toxicity at that time because wasn't part of Weston Price's work, but at least I understood that what the processed foods were, what their components were, and that those were driving nutrient deficiency in people, and that led to chronic disease. And since then, Weston Price's work has guided everything I've done, and it's never ceased to fail me. But and so a lot of people believe that. So back in 2016, I publicly went forward with this hypothesis that had come to my mind back in late 2013, which is that processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, AMD, which is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide now. And so eventually, so I left practice to pursue that hypothesis actually in 2015. And we evaluated data in 25 nations, and I went public with that, wrote a paper, wrote a book, and started a nonprofit foundation, did all that by 2017. And that's where people began to know me, was this, that I had, proffered this hypothesis that processed foods, and particularly seed oils, the industrial seed oils, were drivers of AMD. And that's where people think that I went from there to back out to this big picture, started applying what I'd found about seed oils to overweight, obesity, and chronic disease like coronary heart disease, cancers, diabetes, and so forth. But it was really the other way around. I was understanding in 2013 that it was these processed foods and even seed oils, because Weston Price connected that. He was a small component in his day in the 1930s. But that nugget was in my head, and that anyway, so I understood this relationship, the big picture relationship between processed foods and chronic disease anyway. And then in 2017, 18, 19, I kept noticing, kept coming back to, as I expanded my research, that it was the vegetable oils that always seem to be at the root of overweight, obesity, coronary heart disease, cancer, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, dementia, on and on, autoimmune diseases. And that's what, so I started going public with that in 2019. And that's really what I've been doing ever since. And that was the impetus for this new book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution, because again, and some people, think that, that they might say, well, you didn't come up with the idea, that the hypothesis that vegetable oils are the drivers of all these diseases. And I never ever claimed that I did, Eric. In fact, I think that precedes Weston Price. That theory goes, and I know I'm sorry, I'm monologuing too long here, but that theory goes all the way back to E.V. McCollum in the 1910s, I guess I should say. E.V. McCollum was the one who was studying vegetable oils and put animals on vegetable oils as their only fat. And these animals rapidly stopped growing. The ones that were, still in their growth stages, they rapidly would stop growing. Their coats would become rough. Their eyes would become red and matted. And if they continued with the diet, within a few months, typically, the animals would all die. And this proved that the vegetable oils were nutrient deficient. And today we know that they don't contain vitamins A, D, and K2, but I'm getting into weeds here that I shouldn't.
Well, no, I think it's super important practicalities, and I teach functional endocrinology, and Scandinavian men who either take fish oil or eat fatty fish have larger testicular volume and higher testosterone output.
Yeah.
And that's because luteinizing hormone can come down and bind a luteinizing hormone receptor in the testicle and say, hey, let's go, let's grow, and let's put out some testosterone, when it's not gummed up with inflammatory cytokines. And when you get that omega-6 up and that omega-3 down, you're gunked up. To ground our listeners, this is a wonderful picture of Price from Price Pottenger Foundation. And this is when I was teaching on the Judy Cho Carnivore Summit. I have some old Price Pottenger Foundation photos they let me use in my slide deck. And I always joke that grandpa has a crazier six-pack than his grandson, and there were no low testosterone centers in the jungle. And you get an endocrine system, your hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, your hypothalamus pituitary ovarian axis, your hypothalamus pituitary testicular axis, your hypothalamus pituitary thyroidal axis to function when you have anti-inflammatory oils in and inflammatory oils out. So Weston Price, for those who haven't gotten their mind blown by the groundbreaking Nutrition and Physical Degeneration book, went around the world, and in some places you'll read he evaluated 13 tribes, other places 14 tribes of indigenous tribes. Didn't matter their color, their creed, their location, right? There were Gaelic, Caucasian, Irish fishermen out on the Isles. There were Blackbush African. There were red North and South American indigenous. There were the Maori. There were these tribes all over the place. And he saw the same sinister pattern when they introduced what he called civilized diet, which was grain, sugar, alcohol. These tribes imploded, and diabetes came out, and osteopenia, osteoporosis. But he was a dentist who had two basic tools, a camera and physical exam. And I always joke that in the Maori, they had one cavity per 1,000 teeth he evaluated. And I have 23 cavities in my mouth. So I tell people I have the cavities of 23,000 Maori. And
there we go, yeah.
And my mother, like, she lost a baby in between my older brother and I. She had miscarriage. So I'm just grateful to be here. But she vomited from the time she was pregnant all the way up to the delivery table. And she could only keep down Coca-Cola and chicken soup. And my mom's no longer with us, but I'm so proud of her for just hanging in there. And she was an incredible mom. But that's where my dentition grew up. My teeth grew up in utero on Coca-Cola and chicken noodle soup. So the average Maori, they talked about getting those green lip mussels, and if you were about to conceive, they would feed the best food in the tribe to those who are in conception. So already in utero, they were building healthier human beings. And Price, to your point on going off on the A, D, E, and K, they had 10 times the fat-soluble vitamins of a modern-day American. And so I tell people all the time, it wasn't just the civilized diet, the grain, sugar, alcohol, but it was also what they removed that made illness, right? So you not only had all this crap coming in, you didn't have this great immune modulating, anti-inflammatory, anabolic nutrition coming in. What did you, when you wrote that paper, and I always tell people you have to give data a story, but don't just tell a story, keep collecting data, because that's what can really affect public policy and a new paradigm. And we were talking on the phone, when you read Weston Price, your whole paradigm of medicine and health shifted. And I said, yeah, that's very naturopathic. And in naturopathic principles, the further you stray from nature, the sicker you get. So fine, give Mother Nature the finger. But see how you do living in a car, in a box, going to your other box with low vitamin D. And see how that goes. And then sometimes you're not going to like get a bikini and a Speedo and move down to the equator and open up a biodynamic organic farm. You have a family raised, but you can at least get the crap food out, get the crap seed oils out, eat good, healthy, quality fats, but also just say, okay, I'm going to supplement my vitamin D because I'm an indoor citizen of the world. You know, we can do our best to practically reconnect with nature as best you can. So what did you see when you traveled the world and evaluated these different regions?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't quite characterize it as traveling the world, though. But you're talking about our sort of expedition we did last.
Yeah, when you wrote
fall.
that paper. Well, there's that. But when you wrote your original paper, what
now
did
that
you,
that wasn't done on site. I did all of that work. We looked at data. So I worked with, at that time, a nutrition researcher in Europe and from Macedonia, and who was brilliant at collecting data on sugar and vegetable oil consumption, that I didn't have any skills and probably still don't have all the skills I need to do that sort of thing, to look clear back into the 19th century. But she was able to capture that data. Maria Stoyanowska is her name. And then we worked with some ophthalmologists in the South Pacific to help us get data on the prevalence of macular degeneration in multiple South Pacific islands. But anyway, but in total, we looked at 25 nations of data. So we were looking at sugar and vegetable oil consumption as proxy markers of processed foods, and in those 25 nations versus AMD, macular degeneration prevalence. And the data in every single country supported the hypothesis that it is indeed vegetable oils and sugars driving macular degeneration. Now, the one thing that troubled me at the time, but does not trouble me at all now, and it took me some time to come to terms with this, was that in the island nation of Kiribati, they had high sugar consumption, but the data, the FAO data, and it may be questionable, but their seed oil consumption was virtually zero. And they had almost no macular degeneration. For example, the ophthalmologist that was the only ophthalmologist on the island for a population of 115,000 people, which, in the United States, we would have about 5 ophthalmologists for that population and probably 20 optometrists. Well, there was one ophthalmologist for that entire nation. And he found 2 cases of macular degeneration in that year, 2015, in the country. Two cases. Well, they had really low vegetable oil consumption according to the FAO data. Now, I later learned some of the FAO data is really reliable in the very big countries that are really good at tracking their taxation, and the data can be poor in some of these smaller countries where they just aren't tracking. They don't have the government that tracks the data very well, and so that some of that data became suspect. But nevertheless, I hope that I'm answering your question. But as regarding macular degeneration, that's what we found. Now, I might just mention, while we're on the subject, since we're talked and we're talking about the South Pacific, is that the South Pacific Islanders, have had the worst health transition of all people on the planet, and we know historically that the South Pacific Islanders had probably the most revered physiques in the world. I mean, early explorers saw that. Captain Cook, other explorers, I don't remember their names. Even Weston Price in 1939, in his book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, he said the Melanesians or Polynesians, they had splendid physiques, he called them. And but today, 5 of the most obese and diabetic nations in the world are all South Pacific Island nations. And so we were actually down there, me and a colleague, evaluating their food supply because, again, I'd become suspicious of the data on the vegetable oils. And so we did find out that they have lots of vegetable oils in their food supply now.
When we were having dinner, you shared with me that Captain Cook called Samoa the Garden of Eden, and people just look ripped with these beautiful smiles and these thick heads of hair. And then you went to see how the Samoan were doing, and you saw just some of the most ridiculous rates of obesity in men and women. And what they were originally eating was predominantly fish and coconut oil. And we exported what I call nutritional genocide in our public health policies. And now you'll find their stores full of canola oil, corn oil, all kinds of nonsense. And we were saying, hey, saturated fat is not good for you in that coconut oil. You need to start ingesting poison so we can kill your physiology and kill a powerful culture, right? Now, again, I'm embellishing a little bit, but that's really what we did with our policy. And I think for our listeners, can you kind of just give us a glossary term of what an industrial seed oil is versus an anti-inflammatory oil, just so people understand what the heck we're talking about? I mean, most of our listeners are health conscious, but...
Yes, absolutely. So over the past, almost 14 years of researching all of this, if you look at all the vegetable oils, and I won't have time to get into all the detail, but what I'll say is you can sort of classify them into the industrial seed oils, to fruit oils and tropical oils. The industrial seed oils, let me just start with those. So these are the ones that are really dangerous because they're not only they're high in omega-6 fat, unlike any other natural food, and they also contain advanced lipid oxidation end products, and/or they will produce those in our bodies through metabolism. But these oils are, with names: soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, and peanut oils. All right, so these are all the oils that are high in omega-6, and what I would say are these are the most dangerous oils there are. Okay, then you have the fruit oils, essentially, which I would say essentially olive oil and avocado oil. They're much lower in omega-6, and they don't require industrial processing. They can just be pressed to create the oil, right? And then you have the tropical oils. So you have palm kernel, and coconut. And those are the ones highest in omega-6. Now, I wouldn't say palm oil is really a good oil. It's about 10% omega-6 versus, you could compare that to like soybean oil that's 56% omega-6, all right, which is the major oil in the U.S. But palm kernel oil and coconut oil are about 2% omega-6. And the whole issue is that when you consume high omega-6 diets, the omega-6 linoleic acid, as you mentioned earlier, the primary omega-6 fatty acid in any kind of food, accumulates in our body fat. And as that accumulates in our body fat, it's because it's an unsaturated fat, it is very prone to oxidation. And this sets up an environment that is a biological milieu, I would say, that is pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. And we could get into a little more detail about that. But those four things I call the four pillars of hazard. And when this is the thing, we don't tend to accumulate, if you eat sugar, you don't accumulate sugar in your body fat, right? You convert that sugar into other carbs or into fat if you're going to store it. You store it as glycogen or you store it as fat. But with omega-6 linoleic acid, you will store it as omega-6 linoleic acid, and it will elevate in your body fat. And this presents a severe pathophysiological problem for us that leads us down the path that drives ultimately overweight, obesity, and all this chronic disease like coronary heart disease, cancers, diabetes, and so on.
Read the cover of your book, including overweight, obesity, heart disease, cancers, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, Alzheimer's, macular degeneration, autoimmune disease, anxiety, depression, and much, much more.
Well, here's why. Let me just interject, Eric. Here's why. When you consume these oils, these are not natural foods. And almost anyone, everybody agrees on one thing. Processed foods are terrible. Everybody agrees on that. I mean, the American government agrees on that. The Harvard agrees with that. All of the major institutions, the World Health Organization, all of them and all the research will say processed foods are not good. But what are processed foods? Well, it comes back to the fact that they're primarily made up of three things: refined flours, refined sugars, and refined vegetable oils. These oils, the ones I just mentioned, soybean, corn, canola, all those, right? That's what they're made up of. And, what struck me, a long time ago in 2011 was that Lauren Cordain said, who's the founder of the paleo diet, for those who might not know, he said, call it a cookie, call it a pizza, call it a Pop-Tart. They're all made from basically the same things. It's mostly refined flours, sugars, and vegetable oils. And this stuck in my head. And that's what our grocery stores are lined with, is products that primarily contain those ingredients. Try to find natural animal fat, lard, butter, and beef tallow in processed foods. You won't find it hardly anywhere. You will find soybean, canola, corn oil, cottonseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, peanut. Those are the oils you're going to find. These high omega-6 oils are in those processed foods. And this is what just boggles my mind, is that these major institutions like Harvard, Tufts University in Boston, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, American Heart Association, all of them will agree processed foods are bad. But what is the primary ingredient of processed foods? It is these vegetable oils. On a caloric basis, it is these vegetable oils, because Americans went from zero vegetable oils in the year 1865, as did almost the entire world. At least 90 to 95% of the population globally had no access to any kinds of oils whatsoever. If they had a cooking oil, it was either butter or possibly olive oil, but almost all the rest, and there's some other trivial detail I won't go into because of time, but 90 to 95% of the world did not have access to any oils and never had before 1865. And then cottonseed oil was introduced into the American diet just after the American Civil War, about 1866, 1867. Then we got soybean oil in 1909. And then all the others followed. Well, so we went from 0 grams of vegetable oil per person per day in 1865 to 1 gram a day by 1900, to 9 grams a day by 1909, to 19 grams a day by 1960, to 80 grams per person per day by 2010.
Gross.
Now, at the same time, in that same time frame, we saw obesity rise from 1.2% in the 19th century, at least in men age 18 to 80, which went to 13% by 1960, 15% by 1980, 30.9% by 2000. 42.5% obesity by 2018, with another 31.2% of 31.1% of Americans overweight. So by 2018, 74% of Americans are either overweight or obese. Jeez. All right. Now, why was obesity 1.2% in the 19th century? Well, we didn't have any vegetable oils was the main thing, I believe. It was 1 gram between 1866 and 1900, 1 gram per person per day, roughly, is what we averaged.
Wow.
And so with that, and you can look at the data, so we've accumulated, this data was published by Stephan Guyenet, that you can see that we began to accumulate omega-6 linoleic acid in our body fat. And by 1959, it was 9.1% in our body fat. And it was, by 2008, 21.5% of our body fat is omega-6 linoleic acid. But there's been 4 populations that in 1969, and this was only done once by one researcher, Ian Pryor and colleagues. 1969, he studied the Melanesians of, or is that right? Yeah, the Melanesians of. I just went blank on which island they were on. I think they were anyway. I'll just say Melanesians and Europeans of one island. I'm sorry, I can't remember which one it was. And then it was the Puka Pukans of Puka Puka and the Puka Pukans of Rarotonga. And anyway, those 4 little populations, their average omega-6 linoleic acid was 2.82%.
Wow.
And that, they had no vegetable oils. That's
Wow.
the only 4 studies that have ever been done in all of history on adipose linoleic acid concentration in ancestrally living populations. That is, populations that had no vegetable oils.
Yeah.
All the rest. And now we know today that as of the early 2000s to 2010, the typical Westerner has omega-6 linoleic acid of 14.2%, I believe it is, in their body fat. That's like all over the Western world, from the United States to Europe and beyond.
Whoa. And I don't even know how you keep all the islands and tribes and people and studies in your head. It's amazing. But a couple of things just for our listeners that you just dropped a whole bunch of nutritional bombs on is I view this huge umbrella of inflammation, and oxidation is one of those major ways to get inflamed, right? And when you have these polyunsaturated fats, they're very unstable and prone to oxidation and subsequent inflammation. And we know that the root of all heart disease and chronic disease is inflammation, but that when we talk to patients about cholesterol as a worthless number for predicting who's going to heart attack and stroke. I can have a room full of 100 people. I have no idea who's going to drop dead first of a heart attack if I have your lipid panel. Lipid panel is a wonderful measure of liver function, but then you get into these oxidized LDLs, not as good as a heart scan, but it starts to tell you, you don't just have cholesterol, you have inflamed cholesterol. And if you have inflamed cholesterol of any level, if you have a low cholesterol full of inflammation, the cholesterol is just a powder keg. The inflammation is the matches. And we tell people sleep apnea is a match, a tooth abscess is a match, but these seed oils are deathly matches. They really light things on fire. The other thing is you might have to come over and do some marriage counseling. I love my wife more than I ever had. Like, we are having so much fun together, and we are raising these amazing kids, and everyone's healthy from SIRS, and we're trying to change the healthcare system from what you have to why you have it, and literally help graduate the chronically ill. Be done with it. Stop revolving into the healthcare system. Get out. Live your life. Get your occasional PAP, occasional 3-digital mammogram, heart scan, and colonoscopy, whatever. But she'll bring home from Costco this organic keto granola. And what's the second ingredient? Linoleic acid. So that is something that, you know, when you say all those oils, I just want people to know it can just say linoleic acid on a label, and that's got to get out. And then the last thing you're bringing up for me is, you know, Rob Wolf is an old friend of mine who did a lot for promoting paleo diet and kind of refining it. And I think how great with what you're doing, with what he did, what a lot of people did, when you play the big bad wolf and you say, don't eat these, people still need to be able to go, but you can eat this. And what I think what was so wonderful about paleo and ketogenic and carnivore is instead of saying, I don't do soy and I don't do corn and I don't do safflower, you say, I'm paleo. Yeah. And it changed everything because it created this like cool club of empowered health, you know, and I just think that that all really started with the concepts of Weston Price and Sally Fallon and all those greats who said, hey, get off the processed crap. But now we have the science to say linoleic acid from any of these oils, wildly reactive, wildly oxidizable, wildly inflammatory. And it's going to hit whatever your Achilles heel is, whether it's dementia or achy joints or heart disease or psoriasis flare or eczema. This is a part of every single inflammatory pattern we see in clinical practice.
It is. And Eric, today, you know, for the last several years, I began to think that my work, I basically consider myself now, rather than a physician or ophthalmologist or researcher, I now think of myself more so as a public health advocate. And I realize there's a gazillion things that go wrong with us. And it takes real physicians like you in the trenches, you know, taking care of patients to dig out a lot of these details. But on the, you know, but I'm working at the population level.
Good for everybody.
Yeah, and like there are so when I speak to groups or on podcasts or whatever, I'm basically saying, what is the big picture? Because until you need to get, all of us need to get our big picture correct. And so you get your big picture correct first, make the major changes. Then if everything's not working perfectly, then we need further analysis. And then it can get very difficult to figure out what's going on, obviously, with a lot of these people. But I would just say that if we were to get rid of all of the industrial seed oils, right there, I think we could eliminate 80% or more of our really devastating chronic diseases.
It's amazing.
Coronary heart disease, cancers, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, autoimmune diseases, macular degeneration. I think most of these would go away. They would completely go away if you could get these out and keep them out of the diet, you know, nationally or globally for a decade or two.
Yes, and I agree. But the reason we wanted you on the pod is because you can't wait for government to make those changes.
You sure can.
You have to protect your body and your family's bodies from this garbage. And I love on your book, on the vegetable oil, it says chronic metabolic poison. Chronic metabolic poison. So we're going to have you back on the pod and keep this conversation going, but tell people, you're speaking at CIRSX. So first of all, I want to tell everybody who's coming to CIRSX that we always have a wellness track. We've had Judy Cho and Eric Goodman with foundation training last year. This year we have Morgan with incredible breath work and you bringing literally the data on, no, this has a direct effect on driving these inflammatory diseases. So people will get to know you there. And we wanted you on the pod because a lot of our folks are going to be there and they'll go, oh, that's Obi-Wan Kenobi, the wizard who's going to help eradicate. Because it takes armies to conquer the level of chronic illness right now. And we see your work as a huge pillar, as you were saying, for everyone needs to understand inflammatory oil versus anti-inflammatory oil and really pay attention that this stuff is in any and every barcoded thing everywhere. And you just got to watch your back or you will wind up, and it's a slow kill, right? It's like a death by 1,000 cuts over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And then also a young kid with a raging eczema right there at 7 could have this. So how do people get in touch with your work? Where can they find you and learn more?
Yeah, so first would be this book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution. I do also have a book on macular degeneration. You could find those on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold retail online. We have 2 nonprofit foundations, Ancestral Health Foundation, and that can be found at ancestralhealthfoundation.org, and Cure AMD Foundation, which regards macular degeneration, and that's at cureamd.org. So those, and then I, of course, have many presentations on YouTube.
On YouTube, and then what's your Instagram handle? Because I find those painful and enlightening to watch when you're standing in Samoa in front of a whole aisle of corn oil.
I don't know what that is. We do have Instagram and Facebook and so forth. So my colleague on that, Suzanne Alexander, is running those.
Okay, we'll get your handle. I get so fascinated by kind of, for lack of a better way of saying it, retracing some of the Weston Price footsteps and just kind of getting us an update on how these beautiful people are doing who have been hijacked by the export of Western public health nutritional genocide. Yeah. So
totally agree.
Got a lot of work to do, brother. I appreciate you lifting your end of the board.
Oh, thanks very much, Eric. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
You bet.